Remember, paid tax return preparers are required to exercise due diligence when preparing a taxpayer's return or claim for refund. We have learned that tax preparers must meet the following four specific due diligence requirements. Complete and submit Form 8867, Pay Preparer's Due Diligence Checklist. Complete and keep all worksheets used to compute the credits. Satisfy the knowledge requirement. Satisfy the documentation requirement. We will review the four requirements of due diligence as they relate to the earned income credit. Tax preparers should not rely on software to meet all the requirements. The tax preparer must listen carefully throughout the entire interview process for any information the taxpayer provides that is incorrect, inconsistent, or incomplete in order to meet the knowledge requirement of earned income credit due diligence. What should you do if you hear conflicting information at any time during the interview? I'll tell you it's important to ask questions and write due diligence notes to record the questions asked and the taxpayer's responses, so any inconsistencies can be cleared up before completing the tax return. We must record the interview questions and answers on Form 8867, Pay Preparer's Due Diligence Checklist. The first due diligence requirement for the earned income credit is to complete Sections 1, 2, and 6 of Form 8867 thoroughly and conscientiously, and then submit the form to claim the earned income credit with every e-filed or paper-filed return, both original and amended. It's important to mention that part of our due diligence is knowing the tax law and how to report it on the tax return. Is it ever okay to guess what the tax law is if you don't already know? No, never. What can you do instead of guessing? Ask for help or do your own research. You will never know every piece of the tax code written. Even seasoned tax preparers must look information up and ask for help. It's okay to leave any questions blank or to check the NA box if available on Form 8867 that don't apply to the taxpayer. Now for the second requirement. The second due diligence requirement for the earned income credit is to complete and keep all worksheets. What forms would this include? The EIC Worksheet B, Line 4A, the Worksheet A, Earned Income Credit, EIC, Line 27A, and Due Diligence Notes. If preparing a return using software, it is okay to let the software store the worksheets if they can be retrieved. This retention is needed for 36 months. It's important to note that if you are creating a real taxpayer's return by hand, keep a paper copy of any earned income credit worksheet. However, for this course, you will not be required to make photocopies of the earned income credit worksheets you complete by hand. Next is the third requirement. The third due diligence requirement for the earned income credit is the knowledge requirement, which is the toughest one. A thorough understanding of the earned income credit requirements is important so that you can ask the right questions to determine if the taxpayer is eligible to claim it on their return. Tax preparers cannot rely on software alone to satisfy the knowledge requirement. What do you mean by smell test? Conducting the smell test allows tax preparers to use their training, instincts, and experience to evaluate the information provided and ensure the taxpayer is qualified to claim the earned income credit. What is the best approach to questioning taxpayers? Ask open-ended questions to clear up any incorrect, inconsistent, or incomplete information and record the taxpayer's responses. Leading questions tend to suggest the right answer in the questions. For example, Cameron, you're the only person living in your home other than your child, correct? An open-ended question simply asks for information. For example, Cameron, who lives in your household. Additionally, we need to keep personalized, detailed notes of each tax interview conversation. What about record retention? The fourth due diligence requirement for the earned income credit is record retention. Paid tax preparers must keep copies of any documents provided by the taxpayer that were used to determine if the taxpayer or their dependent met the earned income credit requirements or to compute the amount of the credits when the return was prepared. Now that we've talked about the earned income credit, remember back to the chapter on qualifying dependents and support, where we learned about two non-refundable credits. Does anyone remember which credits those were? Child tax credit, CTC, and the other dependent credit, ODC. We are going to concentrate on the child tax credit. There were tests that had to be met to claim the child tax credit. Let's see if we can remember them. What is the first requirement you remember? There are hints on the screen to help jog your memory. Answers are on page 3.18, Child Tax Credit, and 5.18, Child Tax Credit Recap. The taxpayer must have a qualifying child per the dependency rules. The dependent passed the first 8 dependency requirements. The taxpayer must claim them as a dependent. The qualifying person must be under the age of 17 at the end of the year. The qualifying person must be a U.S. citizen, U.S. national, or resident of the United States. The qualifying person must have a Social Security number, SSN, valid for employment in the U.S. and issued before the due date of the tax return, including extensions. This does not include an individual taxpayer identification number, ITIN. The taxpayer or spouse of filing a joint return must have an SSN or individual taxpayer identification number issued to them before the due date of the return, including extensions. How much is the credit? The amount of CTC is $2,000 per qualifying person. Now let's add a layer. The child tax credit is non-refundable. What benefit is available when the tax liability limits the child tax credit? The additional child tax credit. What are the requirements for a taxpayer to be able to claim the additional child tax credit, ACTC? If you need to pause, go for it. Then resume when you're ready for the answers. Number 1, the taxpayer must have a qualifying person for the child tax credit. This means all the requirements for claiming the child tax credit have been met. They must have a qualifying child dependent. They must be able to claim the qualifying child dependent. The qualifying child must be under the age of 17. The qualifying child must be a U.S. citizen, U.S. national, or U.S. resident alien. The qualifying child must have a valid SSN. The taxpayer and spouse to filing joint return must have a valid SSN. Number 2, make sure Form 2555, foreign earned income, has not been filed. Number 3, the full child tax credit was limited due to the amount of tax liability. Number 4, the taxpayer has one of the following either earned income exceeding $2,500 or 3 or more qualifying children. We will walk through an exercise in a minute. First, let's look at the amount of the credit. What is the amount of additional child tax credit per each qualifying person? $1,700 per qualifying person. The credit can be limited. It is determined by taking the higher of 1 or 2. To better understand how to report this, let's look at exercise 5.3. Here we have Cameron and Gail. Cameron Jameson earned $22,316 for working during the year. He had no interest in dividends. He is filing head of household and has one dependent daughter, Amanda, 7. His Form W-2 shows that $1,384 was withheld for Social Security. $324 was withheld for Medicare, and he will receive $4,213 in earned income credit. Form 1040, line 27. The amount on line 5 of Cameron's Schedule 8812 Credit Limit Worksheet A is $41. Gail Young earned $10,525 for working during the year. She had no other income and no adjustments to her income. She is filing head of household and has 3 dependent sons, Jack, age 12, Martin, age 10, and Robert, age 5. Her Form W-2 shows that $653 was withheld for Social Security and $153 was withheld for Medicare, and she will receive $4,736 in earned income credit. Form 1040, line 27. The amount on line 5 of Gail's Schedule 8812 Credit Limit Worksheet A is $0. We will start with Mr. Jameson. First, we see Cameron's adjusted gross income. The number of qualifying children is on line 4. Line 9 shows the phase-out limit, and line 13 represents the amount from Schedule 8812 Credit Limit Worksheet A. Line 16A show the $2,000 child tax credit minus tax of $41. 16B shows the max amount of additional child tax credit of $1,700. The earned income of $22,316 is more than $2,500, so we subtract $2,500 from that and put $19,816 on line 19. 15% of line 19 is $2,972. Cameron will receive the max credit of $1,700. If Cameron had more than 3 children, what else on Schedule 8812 would have to be completed? Part 2B. Now let's look at Ms. Young. You can see this form is very similar to what we saw with Cameron. Part 2B, line 21, is the Social Security Medicare limitation. Part 2B, line 22, is any self-employment tax adjustments to income, unreported Social Security and Medicare tax, and uncollected Social Security and Medicare or RRTA tax on tips or group term life insurance. Line 24 is her earned income credit. Line 27 is the amount of her additional child tax credit, which is carried to Form 1040, line 28. Now we have the next check for understanding question. Which of the following statements about the additional child tax credit, ACTC, is true? The ACTC is a non-refundable credit, limited to $1,700 per qualifying person. A non-refundable credit, limited to $2,000 per qualifying person. A refundable credit, limited to $1,700 per qualifying person. A refundable credit, limited to $2,000 per qualifying person. Pause and take a moment to smell the flowers before heading to the answer. Did you select C? Boom, you got it going on. A refundable credit, limited to $1,700 per qualifying person, is correct. The additional child tax credit is refundable up to $1,700 per qualifying person. It does not become available unless the child tax credit is limited by the taxpayer's tax liability. A non-refundable credit, limited to $1,700 per qualifying person, is incorrect because the additional child tax credit is refundable. The child tax credit is non-refundable. A non-refundable credit, limited to $2,000 per qualifying person, is incorrect because the additional child tax credit is refundable. The child tax credit is non-refundable up to a total of $2,000 per qualifying person. A refundable credit, limited to $2,000 per qualifying person, is incorrect because the additional child tax credit is refundable up to $1,700 per qualifying person. The child tax credit is non-refundable up to $2,000. Thanks for playing. Similar to the EIC, due diligence requirements apply to the additional child tax credit as well. We'll review the 4 requirements of due diligence as they relate to the additional child tax credit. Are these the same 4 requirements as when taking the earned income credit? Yes. Is there a penalty for tax preparers who do not meet any of these 4 due diligence requirements? If so, how much is the penalty? This can be found on the Earned Income Credit Due Diligence page. Yes, there is a $635 penalty assessed against the preparer for each failure, for each credit on each return, if a tax preparer fails to meet any of these 4 requirements. There is a potential total penalty of $2,540 per return if the tax preparer failed to meet the due diligence requirements for all 3 of the credits claimed and failed to meet the HOH filing requirements on a single return. Let's review the 4 due diligence requirements as they relate to the ACTC. The first due diligence requirement for ACTC is to complete Form 8867. Pay preparer's due diligence checklist thoroughly and conscientiously, and then submit the form to claim the ACTC with every e-filed or paper-filed return, both original and amended. What parts of the Form 8867 must be completed for a taxpayer claiming the ACTC? For the ACTC, you will need to check the box under Part 1 titled CTC, ACTC, ODC, and answer the questions in Parts 1, 3, and 6 on the Form 8867, Pay Preparer's Due Diligence Checklist. As you read and answer the questions help to ensure the taxpayer qualifies for the ACTC and meets the remaining 3 due diligence requirements. Tax preparers get to know these questions very well after a few tax returns. Is it okay to just go down the form and answer for the client since you know what the answers should be to qualify them for the credit, and you're pretty sure you know how the taxpayers will answer? No. It is required that we obtain the information from the taxpayers. Answering for the taxpayer using assumptions you have made is not due diligence. What do you do if a question does not apply to the taxpayer? Leave any questions blank on Form 8867 that don't apply to the taxpayer, unless there is an option to mark NA. Look at the due diligence notes here. Notice they are in a QA format. The IRS has specifically requested that tax preparers use this format for all due diligence notes. Next, we'll look at requirement number 2. The second due diligence requirement for ACTC is to complete and keep all worksheets. Remember that the ACTC has a worksheet that needs to be completed and kept before the taxpayer may claim the ACTC. Does the ACTC have a worksheet that needs to be completed? Yes, Schedule 8812 does have worksheets that are required. They may need Schedule 8812 Credit Limit Worksheet A. Taxpayers' returns created in software programs will automatically complete and store worksheets based on the information input in the software. Copies of these worksheets are stored electronically, so keeping a paper copy of worksheets is not required. Now let's look at requirement number 3. What skill do you think a tax preparer may need for the knowledge requirement? Answers may vary, but should include listening skills and being able to ask questions. This is a requirement that relies on you, the tax preparer, to ask and document questions and answers, and to make reasonable conclusions based on those answers. Therefore, it is important to ask those open-ended questions. If, for example, something the taxpayer says during this part of the interview causes you to question if the correct filing status has been used, you are compelled to revisit questions about the filing status and correct it if necessary. On to the fourth requirement next. The fourth due diligence requirement is record retention. Paid tax preparers must keep copies of any records or documents provided by the taxpayer and relied on to determine if the taxpayer or their dependent met the ACTC requirements or to compute the amount of the credits when the return was prepared. What example of this requirement have you seen in the case studies you've completed? When taxpayers provide medical records or school records to verify residency, copies of those documents have to be kept due to this record retention requirement. In addition to any documents provided by the taxpayer, paid tax preparers need to keep copies of all handwritten worksheets used to calculate the credits. They also need to keep a record of any open-ended questions asked during the tax interview and the taxpayer's responses to ensure the knowledge requirement was met. Now it's time for a check for understanding question. What is the preparer penalty for failure to meet due diligence requirements? $635 per tax return. $635 per tax season if more than 10 occurrences of due diligence noncompliance are found. $635 for each failure per credit per return. Tax preparers are not subject to penalties for failure to comply with due diligence requirements. Pause and noodle on it. Resume when ready. Did you guys see? Way to go. $635 for each failure per credit per return is correct because the penalty is assessed based on each credit claimed and OH on each tax return prepared. Let's see why these other responses are incorrect. $635 per tax return is incorrect because the $635 penalty is assessed for each credit and head of household on each return, creating a potential $2,540 penalty if all 3 credits and head of household are taken on a single return. $635 per tax season if more than 10 occurrences of due diligence noncompliance are found is incorrect because preparers are assessed the penalty based on the number of credits claimed and OH on each tax return. Tax preparers are not subject to penalties for failure to comply with due diligence requirements is incorrect because tax preparers are indeed subject to due diligence penalties of $635 per credit and head of household per return. Beautiful work. You should be proud. Let's turn our attention to exercise 5.4. Meet Kelly Brown and Tim Suderman. You are preparing a tax return for Kelly Brown. She is 18 years old and has 1 child, a baby born December 13, 2024. She tells you she is in her last year of high school. Kelly brought in the birth certificate and social security card for her baby, and she also brought in a Form W-2 showing wages of $1,937. What concerns might this suggest, and what questions should you ask Kelly and be sure to document in the due diligence notes? This is an example of the knowledge requirement of earned income credit due diligence. Knowing that Kelly is only 18 years old and a high school student gives rise to the possibility that she herself is a qualifying child dependent of someone. The amount of income is probably not enough for her to have provided more than half of her own support. Some appropriate questions to ask are, do you live with your parents or other relatives? Who looks after your child when you are in school or working? Who is paying the household expenses? Did you receive any other income or support such as food, gifts, food stamps, help with rent, and so forth? When working with a taxpayer, be sure to record the questions asked and the taxpayer's responses on Form 8867, Pay Preparer's Due Diligence Checklist, in the due diligence notes. Let's discuss Tim. A 19-year-old young man, Tim Suderman, has asked you to prepare his tax return. Tim tells you he has a son, age 2, who has lived with him since his birth in January 2023, and Tim is the sole supporter of his son. Then he shows you his Form W-2, which has $5,950 in wages shown in Box 1. He is not in school and wasn't a student during the year. He says he wants to file as head of household and claim the earned income credit. What concerns does this raise for you, and what are some questions you might want to ask him and document in your due diligence notes? It is clear Tim is not a qualifying child dependent because he is 19 years old and not a full-time student, so he fails the age requirement. He is also not a qualifying relative dependent since his income is over $5,050. For a qualifying child for dependency and qualifying person for the child tax credit, additional child tax credit, and the earned income credit, Tim does not have to provide more than half of his son's support. For the qualifying child rules, his son cannot have provided more than half of his own support. And for the earned income credit, support is not a requirement at all. For the head of household filing status, maintaining a home does become an essential question. Did Tim pay for more than half of maintaining the home for himself and his son? Some examples of appropriate questions might include: how many nights did your son stay with you during the year? Did your son's mother live with you at all during the year? Will she be claiming your son? Why is your son not living with his mother? Who looks after your son when you work? Do you live with anyone else other than your son? Did you receive any assistance in maintaining the home you both lived in from the mother, friends, or family? Who is paying the household expenses? Did you receive any other income or support, such as food, gifts, food stamps, help with rent, and so forth? When working with a taxpayer, be sure to record the questions and the taxpayer's responses on Form 8867, Pay Preparer's Due Diligence Checklist, in the Due Diligence Notes. Are we ready for another check for understanding question? Which of the following statements about due diligence is true? Due diligence for EIC is not as important as due diligence for the CTC. Due diligence is equally important for HOH filing status and every credit that requires it. Knowledge is the easiest requirement to prove to the IRS. Documenting due diligence questions and answers is optional. Pause and think about it, then resume when you see fit. Did you pick B? Okay, good choice, Rockstar. Due diligence is equally important for head of household filing status, and every credit that requires it is the correct response because the penalty for not completing the due diligence requirements is the same for all tax benefits that require it. Why are the other choices incorrect? This statement that due diligence for EIC is not as important as due diligence for the CTC is just flat out incorrect. Due diligence is important for all aspects of the tax return. The IRS penalties also do not make a distinction. The penalty is equal for all lapses of required due diligence. Knowledge is the easiest requirement to prove to the IRS. This is incorrect because knowledge is often the hardest requirement. It is a requirement the tax preparer must demonstrate and record. Is this true? Documenting due diligence questions and answers is optional. No, this is incorrect. The IRS requires questions to be asked and answered when necessary. An IRS speaker once said, "If it isn't written down, it was not asked." This means verbal he said, she said will not suffice. The questions and answers must be documented to be accepted as satisfying due diligence requirements. Beautiful work. Now let's review the homework. For homework, you will be preparing Yvette Bouvier's tax return. This case study should be completed by hand prior to starting the next chapter. The taxpayer's information is found in the Participant's Guide, Chapter 5, in the Case Study 5.1 section. Yvette has two potential dependents, her daughter and her mother. You'll have to determine if they are a qualifying child, a qualifying relative, or not a dependent. You'll also have to determine her filing status. You'll be completing Schedule EIC and the EIC worksheets for the first time. You'll also complete Schedule 8812. Thank you for joining me today. This chapter's video is now officially over. You're free to go. Bye-bye.